Just to your earlier point, and this is kind of ties. I was going to bring this up next episode. I was kind of going to bring that up about the book Simulacra and Simulation, and the concept of hyperreality. And I'll just mention it now. When we're talking about the concept of the expanded universe, like nothing ever ends. It's very funny. Like you take these concepts and you realize what you're witnessing right now is such a insanely mutated version of that truth. That so Marvel would be the example. Marvel sits at the top of the expanded universe pile. Maybe even Star Wars is up there at this point, but Marvel, because they're just making shit up randomly. And that show WandaVision was this concept of now they're connecting different studios together and they're making other universes and realities. So they're bringing back old actors who played the same character. That's what they're talking about. So they'll have Spider-Man played by Tom Holland. They're going to bring back Tobey Maguire's Spider-Man because he's going to be a Spider-Man from another universe. So it's like you're creating. So and this is like the concept of a hyperreality. So just in short, what a hyperreality is, and this gets brought up from time to time, and it's one of those concepts that once you hear it, you're like, oh, that's what that is. I know exactly what you're talking about because people have caught on to this in different ways and never had a name for it, and they've complained about it, and it's kind of obvious. But the idea of a hyperreality, so that's this idea that like art or fiction has to have some basis in reality, something real. Right. And it could be a heightened or an imagined version of that. An example that the creator, what was his name? I had his book on the shelf. I think it was Baudrillard or something. Some
Baudrillard.
Yeah. So the idea was like it could be imagined. He gives the example of science fiction. So science fiction at a point it was grounded in reality, but it expanded on reality. It projected into this new area, but it was based on something real. And he's a Marxist thinker. So a lot of this stuff comes back to the concepts of capitalism and power structures and hierarchies and processes, most likely. So the idea is like that's one thing. And then a hyperreality is built on top of that, where it's only this self-referential system that doesn't reference anything real, and it's only operational. So Marvel is a great idea. So you might have something like a fictionalized character that's supposed to represent like a value set in the system, and that might even be something like a myth or a hero or something. But then you build myths upon myths, and I'll give you the best example. I might bring this up when we talk about it a bit later, or I'll just talk about it now. Actually, I saw the best example of this to summarize what it is. So this was on Instagram. There was this graphic designer who was making a little short video, like an Insta story, about how crazy the lockdown is, and it reminds him of this like occupation. There's troops and cops everywhere in the street. So, and he's a graphic designer and a video guy. So what he did a very realistic version of the streets of, I think it was London, but there were Star Wars characters there. So there was like an AT-AT and stormtroopers and these little droids, and he would take the video and superimpose them over, and it looked hyper realistic to say like, this is the police state we're living in. Now that's such a great example of a hyper reality, because Star Wars itself, the Empire in Star Wars, was an imagined version of like the Nazis, right? Mm-hmm. So and then their cartoon over the top version of World War II wasn't enough to have an emotional reaction. So they had to build. So you have something that happened World War II. Then you take that and make it into Star Wars, which is like a crazy thing version. And instead of actually just referencing World War II, you're referencing that Star Wars to create a new fiction. So it's like fictions referencing fictions referencing fictions. It's that old Fight Club quote, it's a copy of a copy of a copy. At a certain point, there's nothing that is mapped onto reality. So it's this concept that it takes power over everything. So traditionally, you would have the real world and all our value sets, and then fiction and narrative and art based on that kind of strengthens it. And it is in service of reality. But in a hyper reality, the real world is in service of this sort of mechanical operational simulation. And I use the word simulation a lot because a simulation, think about it like holograms. The entire idea of a hologram is crazy. When they had, Tupac's hologram up there. So Tupac was already a celebrity. So he was already like this weird kind of mythological idol that we put up of a person. And then we have a hologram of that because he's dead. There's nothing real there. We copied him,
Yeah.
and we're getting him to say new stuff that he might have said, right? So now he has no control. There's nothing here that is real. There's a copy of a concept that we can still work with and we can still perpetuate. And
Mhm.
this is why comic books and Marvel's the best, because you can maybe even say that we have a hero, then there's Spider-Man. And we always use this example of Spider-Man, but then Spider-Man becomes just a costume, and let's change him up. Let's put a different guy in the costume. And that costume is more reflective of what we think this hyperreality, which is like a black trans person. We have to put that. So now it's just, that's a great example. It's just a costume. You put in this value set that you've just invented. Again, doesn't map onto reality, doesn't come from anything natural. It's just this sort of superstructure.
Mhm.
And it's defined, we'll get into this later, in Marx's terms, it has to keep replenishing itself and replenishing itself. It's just a series of processes and cycles, like a machine. So that's kind of what it is when we talk about expanded universes. And when we talk about, another example would be, we were talking about this before, like video games. Talk about, and I was thinking about this the other day, actually. Sorry, I'm just giving example after example, but once you hear about this, like, this is something, once you hear what a hyper reality is, you snap into it. Like, wow, I know that. Like, everyone complains about this stuff. Like, something feels wrong. Something feels amiss in society, and it
Yeah.
feels hollow and shitty. And like, what is that? What do we call that? Has it always been like this? Because some people will say that it's always been like this. This is natural. It's not. But the idea of fantasy is a fun idea, because that kind of evolves in line with science fiction. But fantasy, rather than being the present, it's the past. It's almost like this hyper reality of European history. And that's why people like Lord of the Rings, or even Game of Thrones, or Song of Ice and Fire, because it's kind of based on an idea of Europe. But then you take it in this other direction, and then you have people who map that back onto real life
Right.
and kind of take that into, that's why Renaissance fairs become Lord of the Rings fairs.
Yes.
And now there's like, a Renaissance fair might be kind of interesting. Like, let's live like, I guess, the Amish who live like that every day.
I,
Right.
I think it like Lord of the Rings as a property itself is not hyper real. It's fantasy. It's great fantasy. But to the point that Lord of the Rings becomes iterated on, and then you have, say for example, video games that aren't even Lord of the Rings video games, but they're referencing Lord of the Rings video games, which are referencing the book. And then after a while, through generations, the words elf and dwarf and troll and orc become English words that we use that have connotations, but the connotations aren't based on our real experiences. They're based on this received narrative, which is so far removed from real human experience that it's decoupled, essentially, right? So it's
Yeah.
that point where, like you were saying before, it becomes decoupled, but because it's something that is so fabricated and so pure, when we want a reference or something to grab onto, we reach for that instead of reaching for the real thing. So you reach for the Empire instead of the Nazis when you want to make a reference, right? You reach for
Yeah.
Voldemort instead of Stalin, which is what you should be doing. But you're saying, no, it's he who shall not be named. Like, no, just say fucking Stalin, right?
Yeah,
Like,
and they don't, and the reason they can't is because they don't know what Stalin or Hitler really are. And the thing is, like, Hitler's a great example, because Hitler is this character that became a hyper reality. Hitler was a guy. If
yeah.
you look at Hitler as a guy, you'll probably end up liking him a lot.
That's a really interesting one. In a sense, we can see how far deep we want to go in this episode. But like the Second World War, the Nazis, the Holocaust, you can be a Holocaust denier. But I think if you want to be objective about it, the Holocaust and everything surrounded it has become a hyper reality, right? It's so full of reference and self-reference and historical adjustment over time, and then media bias. And I mean, the point is, nobody really knows. And more importantly, the point to this thing, right? What it actually represents and how it is used in reference to our society today is completely unrelated to how people viewed it and referenced it when it was happening almost 100 years ago, right?
Yeah.
Like, people, it's again, we talk about the American Civil War, right? With the American Civil War, it's all about slavery. That's a hyper reality, right? It's been referenced and referenced and referenced. And now when you talk about Abe Lincoln and the Civil War, what you're talking about is BLM, right? Because,
Yeah.
like you said, it's been iterated over over generations, and the truth has been lost. And the dangerous things about those ones, about like the Civil War and the Nazis, is that people feel a little bit more comfortable using them, even serious people, because they think that it's a real thing. But it's not a real thing. It's a hyper reality which was made from the fabric of a recent historical event, but it's not real. You're not talking. You're not. You know what I mean? Like you're for just as last example. What I'm talking about here is people who will quote the Nazis or quote Churchill based on a Paramount film that they saw, versus having read a memoir or a book or even a fucking documentary. People who will say, well, I know that this happened because didn't you see that movie, and Enemy Mine, where he shot 9 guys from the bell tower? Like, no, that's not real. That's a film. So I don't know.
If you said Enemy Mine, I think that was like a 1970s movie
that's
about like
the
an
wrong
alien.
one. I'm trying to remember. What was the one? The one with the Russian who shoots 100 guys. Yeah, Enemy Mine is alien. Yeah, see, so I'm glad that I don't live in that hyper reality. Jesus Christ.
Enemy Mine is a 1985 West German American dark science action fiction film directed by.
Oh God, I'm so sorry. That's such a bad movie.
I'm just reading the Wikipedia now. Like I don't know. Okay, wait. Here enemies because hold on. Enemies because they were taught to be, allies because they had to be, brothers because they dared to be. Enemy Mine. And it looks like the way it sounds like Enamine. Enamine is kind of how it looks. Sorry, but just brothers because they chose to be. And it's like a 1980s alien guy. But anyway, no, but because you can go very deep with these ideas. You can go very deep with hyperreality, and this is what the philosophers do, because you'll take this idea, and we're talking about it in relation to media and entertainment, but you can take this and use it as to explain the entirety of society, which is what Marxists do, which is why, in describing this, the book Simulacra and Simulation is very good, but it's somewhat difficult to read because it throws you right into it. From the first page, it's go. But it spends, I'd say, the last 3/4 of the book just giving applications and examples of it. So it explains the concept of simulacra, and then it's like, here's what it means for Hollywood, for advertising, for animals. And when he gets to animals, he starts talking about really praxeological, just Marxist stuff. He talks about superstructures and everything, and he'll kind of drop it in there. He'll go off for a while, and it's like, and this is why capitalism is destined to fail, and this is why every system is fascist in nature. And it's like, okay, all right. Yeah. Like he keeps bringing it back to, it's fascist, and that in everything, every rule is fascist. Really, that's what he says in the book.
Yeah.
As you
why?
Get through it,
you know why? Because he's bought into a fascist hyper reality. He doesn't know what it actually is.
That's actually a great point. But just to build on this, because I want to give a good enough example, like
before you do, the film I was thinking of was Enemy at the Gates with Jude Law. Just for the record.
Okay, for the record, I saw that movie in theaters, and I was too young to see it, and I went with some friends. When you have friends who are in the same grade, but sometimes just due to birthdays, they're like a year older than you for a couple months. Yeah. And I went to see that, and I had to get my mom. They got their tickets, and my mom had to come in and buy me the ticket, and then hand it to me in front of the person she just bought it from. And then I went in and saw Enemy at the Gates, and it was Jude Law, and I want to say it was Owen Wilson too. I don't think it was, but no, that's my memory.
That's another similar one, but I can't remember. Behind Enemy Lines or something.
That was Drill Bit Taylor. You're thinking of the Royal Tenenbaums. Oh yeah, no, but I remember I remember seeing that one. I think there was a sex scene in it, and I was in the theater, and these guys are like my age. But I remember when my friend leans over, is like, "I don't think you should be watching this." I'm like, that's fucking funny. In hindsight, I didn't appreciate how funny that was at the time, because you're a kid. It was like, shut up. So that would have been a PG-13 movie. So I would have been technically 12, I think. Shit. Right? Yeah.
How long ago? When was that? Christ.
Yeah, that was an old movie, and I think that was a movie where they were Germans, right? Like that was the story, or am I thinking behind?
I think it was Nazis hunting Russians in Stalingrad.
It's crazy, like that movie got made, You couldn't do that movie now. I know that's a midwit take,
The
but
Nazis were the bad guys, I think.
were they?
Yeah.
Damn.
Yes, the Russians were the good. I mean, it's the long march, man.
The only movie we have where the Germans and the Nazis were the good guys is Inglorious Bastards.
I don't think that's how it's meant to be interpreted. You remember that movie Inglourious Basterds where the Nazis are the good guys and everybody wants the Jews to die? Yeah, I remember that. That
Yeah, well, like I
Tarantino
said, no
classic.
one. Yeah, well, no one's watching Inglorious Bastards for the bear Jew. No one's doing that. They're watching it because Hans Landa is awesome,
Yeah.
and and then the other main character, that he's a Nazi sniper who got a movie made about him, and he's actually a nuanced, complicated character because he's still a soldier. He's kind of traumatized by it. He doesn't like watching his own movie, and he's just falling in love with this bitch who betrays him. Like watching Glorious Bastards with a critical eye, and I think
Mhm.
the Nazis are the good guys in that one.
All
And
right.
and, and the Jewish Americans are just torturers and
Yeah.
brutalizers.
Yeah.
Yeah, like that scene where he like beats the Nazi's head and he's like, what's that? A metaphor is like courage, and just stares him in the eye. I'm like, damn. And you got Eli Roth here, like, yeah, yeah. Quentin Tarantino's one of our guys, but but just this, I'm gonna wrap this up just with Simula, just to give the best version of this about his argument. So uh, one thing he talks about is this hyperreality and this system, how it just has to perpetuate itself, because in Marx's theory the perpetuation of the system and how it cycles through itself and replenishes itself is very, very important. So he says the way it legitimizes itself, and he kind of bring this into politics as well, is through crisis and the anti form of itself. So he would make the argument that all politics exists in this hyperreality, and the way you justify its existence is through almost a catastrophe. And you might say something like the Kennedy assassination, where it threatens it and it strengthens it. But even these crises are manufactured. And an example of this that I think people could get might be even the typical left-right dichotomy in both America and Canada, in the West, really, if we're getting down to it. And any political philosophers of old, especially monarchists, would say that if you have a civilization or society set up between a left and right dichotomy, like you don't have a society, it's just chaos. And he said, this is the monarchist argument, or the authoritarian argument, that look, you can have dissent and corrections to the system within an absolute power in a monarchy, but the idea that you have just these constant butting heads, like, you're never going to solve anything. And if one way to think of it is, the entire democratic system in America is set up to have these very manageable revolutions at constant intervals over time. And the best example is like Bush, Obama, Trump, Biden, the executive order thing. It's like, we're going to bring in the new guy, and the first thing he does is he cancels out a lot of the stuff with this gusto and this energy that, yeah, it feels like a revolution, but it's not. It's a
Yep.
bureaucratic revolution.
Yep.
It's a very manageable, but to people, it's like they see that and they see changes happening, but it's not really. So the entire idea of, you can say, a political hyperreality where it keeps justifying itself with these crises and these sort of revolutions that never actually threaten the system itself, which is an interesting way of looking at it. But it justifies its own existence, because after the January 6th protest, everyone's saying, like, no, this shows that this system is more important than anything. All of a sudden, Congress is sacred.
Yeah.
All of a sudden you're having these words that this return to normalcy. It's sacred. It's invincible. It's like, we can't let this die. It's like this shitty system that no one really likes came out of this strengthened. And so you can make the argument that's how the hyperreality reinvigorates itself. This thing that really has no relation to society. It's so bureaucratic. It's so it's a great show to watch. This is Veep, or even House of Cards. I prefer Veep, where it really shows you that it's just favors for favors and relationships and networking and betrayals and backstabbing. And that's interesting. That feels like things are getting done. It's processes. I see that there are processes occurring, but nothing is changing. Things are just exploding and canceling out, exploding and imploding, exploding and imploding, and just this sort of equilibrium of action, but nothing's happening. Nothing's really changing. And if anything is changing, it's not happening in that system. There's some other power structure.
Mm-hmm.
But so the idea, a great way to look at hyperreality as a simulation, which is what you would call it, is a simulacra is a second order thing. So simulacra would be art. It would be something that's fake, but you know it's fake. And even though you know it's fake, you know it, again, it's grounded in reality, so it has value. But a way to look at a simulation, like we'd said with the hologram idea, it exists beyond real and fake. So, and sometimes we get stuck in that I use the word dichotomy again, where it's like, there's something that's real and there's something that's fake, and it's one of those two. But really, the concept of a hyper reality is above that. It supersedes fakeness and reality, and that's what makes it so fucked up. But that means it's so easy to manipulate too, and that you're just going along with this sort of robotic process, and that's a lot of when you explain that, you look at society and how you live day to day. And like, yeah, like I understand all the things I'm supposed to do. I know what things cause punishments. I know the steps I have to take to get from point A to point B. I don't know why I'm doing it. All I know is I need to do this. And we talked about this before when it comes to careers, even. Like, how many people working your job, you know why you're doing what you're doing other than to survive, other than that's what you're supposed to do. Because here's another example. Sorry, it's the example street. All right, we're taking a walk down example street. The idea of a work ethic, so like they talk about the Western, the European work ethic. Now the work ethic it matters for a reason, because that had a connection to reality, that you had to have a work ethic to accomplish something, to build something. You know what I mean? And it had a cause and effect. But the idea of work ethic on its own doesn't mean anything. But you can separate it from the real, and all you're left with is this idea that we're supposed to work hard. And if you're working hard, that it's good. It's better than being lazy, right? Because being lazy is bad. I'm working. That's what you're supposed to do. But it's like, what are you working at? What are you working in service of? Now, some people know what they're working in service of. A lot of people don't. But it's this system. It's a series of processes that you're doing the thing you're supposed to do, but it's so separate from how you don't understand what it's in service of. Anyway, sir, were you about to say something?
No, you'd gone gray there, but you've got me now, eh? You can hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, good. No, I did actually catch most of what you said. Yeah, no, I agree. I'd actually never heard of it parsed out that way, especially in terms of working culture, I guess, in like kind of like ground level society, but that actually makes a lot of sense. To me, it's little, like when I think of work ethic, I don't think of it that way. I think of it in terms of my actual terminal goals. And then that my motivation is if I don't work hard, I can't reach those goals. And they're very internal to me. Right. But then, I mean, I've mentioned that before, that to me, it's baffling. I can't imagine myself in a working environment where I knew what I was doing in terms of I knew what keys to hit on the computer, but I didn't know why. I didn't know the real ultimate goal. I didn't know where this job and this company and myself and my boss, how we slot into society, what we're doing. And then for that reason, I can't evaluate it. I can't, make a real informed decision on whether I should be here or whether I should just burn the building down and leave. Right.
Yeah. And he would argue that you come to that realization and you kind of snap out of like, wait, what am I doing? What I'm doing? And you realize this is why I think the story was that the Wachowskis they read this and factored it into the Matrix. And if you look at the Matrix from this perspective, the first Matrix movie is pretty much this: you realize you're in the system. And you realize you see processes, and that's why like the machine made this world, and you kind of see through it, and you see how the machine's operating, you kind of bend it and fuck with it. That's sort of the philosophical idea behind the Matrix, aside from the cool fucking visuals and shooting at cops for no reason. but the idea is that another thing about the hyperreality is that the more extreme it gets and the more separate from actual reality and actual value sets, and anything that resembles any value set, the more you crave it, the more people demand it. Because people, like I said, once you explain this to people, they get it. They know something's wrong. They know things are fucked up. They know, and that's why I give Marvel as the ultimate example, because that exists in a movie way. That also exists in an ideological way. That exists as a symptom of the system. Now, the problem with the society we live in right now, and I say this about people on the right and the left and whatever you want to call it, because even the idea of the right and the left is a dumb, reductive way to look at things. The way to think about it is like, fuck, I forget what I was going to say. Totally forget what I was about to say. I got too off on a tangent there.
No, it's all right.
Yeah. Anyway, yeah. Yeah, always said they crave it more. Like people realize that something is wrong, but they don't. They're kind of paralyzed once they realize it. They're paralyzed. They don't like. I gotta. Do I keep going? Do I break the system? I can't exist outside of it. They don't really know what to do. But people,
Yeah, yeah.
you'll notice that I think more than in history, people are more critical of these systems. That's interesting because we'll always say that. How many critics are there out there of video games and movies? Everyone's a critic. And that seems nerdy and lame, and like, who would want to do that? You're trying to make money off of, you could say that exists within a hype reality, like you're making content. That's the ultimate hype reality. You're making YouTube content that is off of this content, which is a copy of this, a copy of that, but it's also the fact that it's turning so aggressively back on itself means that people are aware of this. They get it. They get that it's fucking retarded and hollow,
Right.
but they're almost paralyzed. Like, but I don't know, we can't turn back time, because turning back time, that won't work. Everyone kind of knows that too. Like you're not going to go back to women in sundresses walking through wheat fields. That's
No,
just
but
not in the cards.
you can synthesize that and come up with something that incorporates the better elements of that, and we can move forward. But I was going to say there's an element of the whole universal to local dichotomy a little bit, right? Or the idea that when you have these hyper realities, they don't work very well on a local level. They don't work very well on a specific level, but the benefit to them, or the beauty of them, is that they allow you to project out in all directions and expand. Working from one little nugget of original reality, you can expand out your beliefs in all directions. You can project, right? So, like if you think of society, like you live in a city and you know a little bit about your neighbors and you will know a little bit about the business. Say you live in Chicago, right? You can form an internal hyper reality over time about what New York is like based on your understanding of living in Chicago. And that's your hyper reality, is this is the American city. And you might be shocked to go to New York and find what those people are actually like, but to you, that's what's real. And when you break that away and you move to these other cities, that might be very chaotic and very unnerving, and you don't really know how to behave. But it's a positive, beneficial thing, right? Because I think it's what do you call that? It's a placebo, right? Like having that hyper reality decouples you from good decision making on a local day-to-day basis. And it makes you feel better that you have a model that works across all time and space, and that everything is a little bit more symmetrical and easy to understand. But it's tricking you, because the truth is the world is more complex than that, and it's ever changing. And you should not be viewing, for example, what has gone on in Cambodia over the past month. You shouldn't be viewing that like it's Star Wars, because it's not Star Wars. It's a developing political situation, and a lot of people are going to die, right?
Yeah.
But
and so we say a couple of things. I'll just say three things here, and it just ties right into that. And so, reading this book and reading a lot of these Marxist philosophers, especially modern day ones, it's funny how much they and fascists really align on these fundamental topics. I don't think we'll be able to get to the Marx stuff today. We might be able to, but the idea, I'll just lead with this by saying that it's funny when you read Marx's Capital that a lot of modern, what you call the bread tubers, and I've mentioned bread tubers before, and I never really described what they are, so people might not know what the hell I'm talking about. A bread tuber, it's fans of YouTubers. It's an online community with the content creator ContraPoints kind of at the top of the pile, who is a substance abusing gay man who dresses up in drag, and that's what constitutes as being trans these days. And then there's also like, we're talking like millions of followers, millions in revenue through Patreon, very like they're comparable to mainstream people, I would say, more than like your average news anchor, pretty much. They're I would say they're more culturally significant than like fucking John Stewart. I'm such a fucking boomer. Like
No,
who,
but
like
like
John Oliver.
your average local news, think like WK UK 9 o'clock news. Like these fucking people who live in your neighborhood are much smaller.
Oh yeah, no, it's smaller. But then I'm even comparing like probably bigger than like Jimmy Kimmel, I
Oh
would
yeah,
argue.
yeah, yeah.
But then there's also Philosophy Tube, who also recently came out as trans, oddly enough. And then you'd have your Vouch, you'd have Mate, not Destiny, and then there's even some people on the left who criticize that. There's this guy Caleb Maupin who calls it the synthetic left, which I thought was good. There's some interesting people on that side, but so they're also very cosmopolitan and very urban, and they're very very extremely online, and there's ironic, and you put maybe Chapo's Trap House in there as well, even though I would say they're more, at the very least, well read than a lot of these other people, but even if I disagree with them. But they also love cosmopolitanism and sort of globalism as well. Not all of them, but most of them. But Marx himself was very, very critical of this, and so were a lot of the fascist guys. So Oswald Spengler, for example, they would both criticize the city, and Marx said like a city is in his words, the end result of capitalism, because what you do is you rip people from the soil, the blood and soil, which is a very fascist concept, but it's right there in Marxism too. Separate people from the soil, from the community, and put them in this giant meat grinder that just seeks to subdivide people and separate them and make sure they can't cooperate or learn. And that's what he says. Like in a capitalist, hyper-capitalist system, people just work these specialist jobs, but find it very, very hard to learn things and gain knowledge and increase their status. Anyway, but it's funny that sort of parallel that's run. But Spengler, what he talks about, and we've covered this before in a previous clip, he talks about like the dead civilization, and so does Julius Evola actually, by talking about that. And this ties in the hyperreality thing, that when a civilization is dead or dying, or once it achieves the status or the winter of itself, the civilization, it becomes extremely self-referential and nostalgic, that it's always trying to look backward and recapture that vigor from when it was kind of on the upswing. And you see that in modern storytelling right now, like how much of what we want to watch was just depictions of a better past, and maybe not quote better as in utopian, but better whereas like it resonates better. Like when you talk about these, that's why people love historical dramas. They love reading about history and seeing these stories, because it feels more real to them. And a civilization is always trying to make monuments to its own past and not so much live in the present. And that's something you see in the media, but also in the hyper reality. So here's what would happen if you're in a civilization that kind of has a real value set, and it's strong, and it's got that motivation and drive. You can deal, and that's the Lord of the Rings example. Lord of the Rings, it's you're taking it and you're projecting it in this new form. And Lord of the Rings is very much based off of European ideals, linguistics. He created an entire elven language. Like it's based on reality, but it's a simulacra. Like it's something that when you look at it, it has more value than A Song of Ice and Fire. And when you listen to George R.R. Martin talk about it, one of his famous criticisms of Lord of the Rings was it was too mythological. It wasn't grounded in reality. He wanted to know what Sauron's tax policy was going to be. He wanted to know. Then when people are like, oh, where did do hobbits fuck? Are hobbits sucking dick? They never cover that, But that's like not what it is. And the fact that, sorry, continue.
Yeah, sorry, just on that, the whole thing, because that's such a perfect example, is Tolkien creating high fantasy, and then 2 generations later, Martin taking it and making it hyperreal and bringing it back down into Sauron's tax policy. And what I was going to say is, if you want to look, just take as an example economics data, right? If you take a plot, like a point plot of anything, any set of economic data, that plot, that with all those numbers, that's the real, right? And it's messy and it's hard to understand. And as much as it's true, it's difficult to pull information out of there that's functional and usable and understandable. So you draw a trend line, or you draw a curve, or maybe you put some marks within that thing. Now the curve itself, that's the hyperreal. The curve, the curve is something that is easy to take away. You can even remove the points from the graph, and all you're left with is the curve. Now, what Martin is doing here is he's taking the curve and he's extrapolating from the curve without knowing what the original points were, what the points should be. And he's just drawing a curve out of points.
Yeah.
Or he's saying one over, under, over, under, over, under across the curve to make this beautiful zigzag. But it's like, that's not real. And like the original curve represented an important pure distillation of the original. It was kind of like the cover to the book, but it's not the fucking book. It's not the whole story, right? Like you can't. We talk about cargo cult all the time, but it's similar to that. Like you didn't know where that came from, or at least you could know, but you don't care. And now all that matters to you is the curve. All that matters to you is the fantasy. Right? And you just want to play with the fantasy. You want to make the fantasy more real instead of using fantasy as a tool to explain the real.
Yeah, no, that's actually a much, much smarter way of saying what I was trying to say, because that's what they're trying to do. They don't know what that curve was based on. They just know it's important. So they try and figure out how can I make this more like those points, and you're just making up points. But that's why I'm going to throw orcs into this. Like, orcs were modeled after something. It's kind of funny. Like he had mentions in here about how one of the reasons that you're in. I think there's actually some lag on your side too. By the way, we might need to stop and start again.
Yeah, I think so.
All right. So sorry, I had to cut out there. Midway through every podcast, there's something that we have to restart, and it's happened every single time. And I think it's got to be part of our system. It's got to be part of our hyper podcast reality.
It's part of what makes us so unique is retards. We're stupid.
Just to summarize what I was saying, that the desire for people to see reality in movies is a new thing. It's really only happened in the 20th century, but the idea of something has to be gritty and real for you to even kind of register with you is a curious desire to have, because if you were just confident in your life and your society and your reality, you could deal with like an imaginary like that's what art used to be, and that wouldn't see. If you're living in this giant fake construct, all you desire to see is something that feels real. Or even if it's like a fake version of reality, we'd rather have we're looking for simulacra. We're going in the opposite fucking direction. And it's funny, and that's how you end up with something like Lord of the Rings, which is a simulacra, which is a heightened version of reality. And then you end up with a Game of Thrones, which is our hobbits busting. That's how you get there. That's how, what we need. We need to know that. Otherwise it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter to me.
Yeah.
And the process that seems so sickening, and this book I believe was written in the 80s. So really what I always try and tell people is the information revolution has shattered every paradigm. And that's why, even looking back, like even when we talk about third positionism or something like that, it's like it needs to be a new version of that, because the internet, even within this book, they talk about how information is almost diametrically opposed to meaning. And then we're living in a world where it's just all information all the time. We haven't really evolved to know what to do with that yet. We know how to search for meaning. We know, but we're almost it's so obfuscated by information and processes and all these little levers we have to pull day to day that we don't know how to do anything else. Yeah. But like we had talked about in a previous episode, like consider this process that you're a person and you're watching a movie. And you see this right now with Black Lives Matter and a lot of people, that representation matters. To them, the most important thing is seeing yourself in the movie. I need someone who looks like me. And then you say, okay, we're going to throw, and that's where they get mad at tokenism. We're going to throw in someone who looks like you. But that's not enough. Now that representation needs to be a heightened version of that. It needs to be a perfected, almost utopian version. So that's how you end up in a situation where you can't have black criminals, but you can have a lot of black judges. Every judge has to be black, but there's no black criminals. They all have to be Irish. And that's something like people would have noticed years ago, but that's what it is. And then it's like that moves along, and then now it's not just me but a perfected version of me, and that needs to be all that's there. And then that remaps itself onto reality, because that's what you're teaching kids. That's them teaching you who you are. So that's a process that we get into where now it's in the hyper reality. Now it's so far removed from what things actually are and can be addressed, that you're just becoming a hologram. And this is something that people can consider, that when you're so in the system, if you're the type of person who is so keyed in to the media and movies and music and everything, you are essentially making yourself a hologram. If you look at a movie or anything and say, that's me, I identify with that person, you're making yourself into a hologram. You're almost just a projection of this total fake hyper reality simulation that's taken a human form. So when people talk about oppression and they talk about brainwashing, they talk about like how to change the world, really all we are is projections of this system. And I think that's why when people, even when they're bringing up the new Matrix sequel, which is going to be bad because most of them are bad, but I'm like, that could be like, what is humanity? At what point are we just, are the machines in service of us? Are they trying to keep us under control? Like, let's talk about vague power structures, which is what Marxists always want to talk about. Very vague, ill-defined power structures. But how much of it is the power structure trying to create a sandbox to distract us, or are we just holograms of this projection? Like when you look at the Joker movie, like that's me. I identify with that. But wait, how? Because that get, maybe the Joker's a bad idea because his whole thing is kind of rebelling against the system. But is that just a safe rebellion? You know what I mean? Like, is that
Yeah.
just a construct of this fucking system? Anyway, so like again, you can go so deep with this. You can get, like many Marxist philosophers do, say this is everything. This is our entirety, and that's why everything must be smashed. Because a lot of these people would say that's also military, cops, that's religion, that's every value that we have is fake, and we need to have communism to solve that. That's how you get there. I'm not saying go there. I'm actually against that. That's why the concept of hyperreality is pretty popular on the right. But if you read this book, if you read Simulacra and Simulation, I'd say 2/3 of it are very strictly Marxist in their scope. So you don't need to do that. But just to explain it to people, that's what it is. And it's an interesting concept. And again, this is something, the only reality is the hyper reality, in the sense that once you hear that, like, oh my God, that resonates with me. I feel this. This explains what it is, but it's still, it's such a storm around it. It's like, okay, what now? You know, what do you, at that time, that's how you get Fight Club. That's how you get a fantasy like Fight Club, where like, let's just blow up the banks. Let's just smash a, let's be schizophrenic and blow up banks.
I was thinking about that. It was I don't think it was you said it. Somebody said it, and I was watching something else. But somebody had made a comment about how dumb it is that people view Fight Club as prescriptive or at least realistic. And I was offended because it's like I view Fight Club as realistic and somewhat prescriptive. And then it's that same question: is this because it is a narrative, a fantasy based on reality, and it's telling me something, it's giving me some meaning, it's helping me parse through meaning in my own life? Or is it because it's hyper real and I'm latching onto it because I don't understand my real life and it's disconnected from how things actually work? It's just something that I'm idolizing out of I'm deceiving myself, I guess. I don't know. But no, we should blow up banks. I think so.
That's some ironic shit.